Are we ready to go?
Yep, you're up.
Okay. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Autonomous Vehicle Work Group Executive Committee meeting. I'm Jim Restucci, Interim Chair and State Transportation Commissioner. We have a great meeting scheduled for you today with lots of good presenters. I would ask that you hold your questions to the question and answer portion of the agenda. And also, because of the time and the questions we need to ask of the Exec Committee, only Exec Committee members will be invited into the discussion. Catherine, could you call the roll, please?
Sure can. So we have Representative Matt Banky on the line. We have Roger Millar on the line, Charles Knutson. We've got Dr. Wang, Kurt Augustine, Brian Mistel, Bryce Yadden, Anna Devart. And then let me check since quite a few people have joined. You can also feel free to put your names in the chat as well if I missed you. We've got Laura Johnson on the line as well. We've also got Representative Dye. We've also got Pam Hancock. Teresa Burnson, and Tom Albert.
Okay, I believe we have a quorum. Correct me if I'm wrong.
You should be good to go, Jim.
Okay, thank you very much. We do have a quorum, so we'll go ahead and get this meeting started. First item up is Scott to discuss the slides, and Ari Swanson from Enviro Issues to provide an overview of how to engage in the meeting.
Good morning, everybody. I think Era, I believe, is going to kick us off here, just kind of walking through the functionality of the virtual meeting and how this is going to flow again today. So, Era, if you're ready.
Yep, I'm ready. Yeah, I know many of us are getting quite comfortable with online webinars and online meetings, but just to recap engagement and participation in this meeting, we can go to the next slide. If you, as Jim mentioned, we ask that questions be reserved for our executive committee members. And to pose a question, please do use that questions chat box that shows up on your right-hand panel. And we will be monitoring that box, answering any questions that you have as we go. And then Jim will call on you in the order that we receive them. During the meeting, just make sure that you are muted. That little button there that's got the microphone should be red. If you're dialing in by phone, it'll look like a phone, and that will be red as well. And then we can go to the next slide. As I talked about, the questions chat box is the place to ask your questions or just say you want to ask a question. We'll either read those aloud or we'll call on you directly, as we did in our last meeting. Let me go to the next slide. And then for those of you who are dialing in on the phone, you're still able to access those audio controls and the chat box if you're also viewing the presentation online. If you are not viewing the presentation online, you can mute and unmute yourself by pressing *6. And then, of course, when not muting, please just ensure your phone line is muted. So those are the basics, and I think we can go ahead and get started.
Okay, thank you, Ari. Next up is Scott. Scott Shogan from Vice President of WSP USA. Scott?
Thanks very much, and good morning, everybody. Looking forward to our discussion today. We wanted to start off today picking up off of a theme that we touched on at our last meeting back in May. And that's really kind of setting a forward direction for the work group overall and considering kind of alignment of the policy goals that were adopted by the work group and how that fits into work group initiatives going forward. Next slide, please. So this information went out to the executive committee, but we wanted to walk through it, for anybody that may not have had a chance to look at this or fully understand it. And we want to start with just kind of a fundamental question to the executive committee. So given the purview of the autonomous vehicle work group legislation and the sunset date of 2023, essentially the question to this committee is, where does this committee want to focus for the duration of the group? And what role do the CAT policy goals that were adopted by the committee play in guiding that direction? That's kind of the fundamental question that we're trying to drive at today. So we're going to do some polling to kind of get at some priorities here, but also looking forward to some discussion around this topic as we go forward. Next slide, please. So we want to start with some foundational information here. We thought it was important that we take a step back and get everybody on the same page with regards to nomenclature as we talk about, this autonomous vehicle work group, which is the title of the legislation or the title of the group as it was written in the legislation. So what is an autonomous vehicle? An autonomous vehicle is simply a vehicle that uses an automated driving system for some or all of the driving tasks that a human would do. So that may seem very basic, but it's important, kind of foundational information. But additionally, it's not operated in direct coordination with other system users. That's kind of the common understanding of autonomous vehicle, being that it really operates somewhat in isolation. It's using its sensors to see its surroundings, but it's not coordinating directly with other users. It's self-sufficient in terms of those systems and sensors. You may hear almost interchangeably the use of automated vehicle. And I wanted to just put a kind of a caveat on that to understand that automated vehicle has been kind of adopted in the industry as a bit of a broader term. That is an autonomous vehicle, but that may also otherwise be connected or coordinated with other system users. So it's a bit broader. It's a vehicle that's using an automated driving system, but that also may be connected, may be engaged in other system users in different ways. Next slide, please. So let's talk about CAT. Cooperative transportation is what from CAT means, and what that really means is a much broader kind of interpretation of this overall ecosystem. It's the confluence of automated technology, of connected technology, but also of electrification, of shared mobility, of a lot of these kind of convening industry trends that are moving forward mobility. The goal of CAT is really to look at it more broadly from a system perspective, and is a system perspective that contributes towards safe and efficient transportation system, one that emphasizes public transit, active transportation, and economic vitality, stepping away from purely a vehicle-based definition and looking at much more of a system definition and how it serves our communities that we live in. So it's about more than just vehicles. It's about modes of transportation. It's about the overall systems and specific applications of technology as they fit into those systems. So it's a much broader construct that those CAT policy goals were built around. So we thought it was important to start with that and make sure that everybody's on the same page from a terminology standpoint going into the discussion. Next slide, please. So from there, we wanted to provide, again, a bit of background context and start with the legislative mandate, just a refresher on what the legislation actually charges this work group doing. So following developments in AV technology and overseas, exploring approaches to modify state policy, rules, and laws to further public safety and prepare for the emergence of AV technology. So again, this is a lot of obviously the topic areas that the work group has been working through in really understanding how state policy may be changed to prepare for the emergence of this technology, to make sure that it's a safe introduction and into the state, and to look for opportunities for how testing can be done and properly managed in the state. Sharing information, obviously fundamental to these meetings is sharing information on AV technology and policies, and that's certainly happening at the subcommittee level as well. And of course, just as a reminder that there is a reporting requirement of the Transportation Commission advancing recommendations from the work group each year. And the legislation sunsets at the end of 2023. So the kind of that time frame and how much time we have left is an important part of this discussion today as well. Next slide, please. So pivoting from that, we wanted to talk and give, again, a little refresher on the CAT policy goals, because we think that's an important backdrop for this discussion. So the policy framework that we're referring to was developed by the Infrastructure and Systems Subcommittee. There was tremendous amount of feedback over the COVID-19 that went into the development of those goals. And then they were advanced as a recommendation to the Executive Committee last year. They were adopted by the Executive Committee and advanced forward to the Transportation Commission, where they were again endorsed by the Transportation Commission and included in the work group reporting from last year. So these policy goals were advanced through the process. So let's just touch on them each quickly. Next slide, please. So just a refresher on what the goals really encompass. So organizing for innovation. So really basically structuring all of the entities within state government, the authorities that really have their hands in this technology to adapt quickly to the changing technology and what the needs are for the state. Shared mobility, so encouraging and incentivizing shared mobility as a fundamental tenet of CAT policy. Economic vitality and livability. So this really gets to part of my CAT definition, and really creating a resilient network that creates economic vitality in the state. Infrastructure and context-sensitive street design as another piece. So looking at durable physical and digital infrastructure to support the movement of people and goods. So centered around these other CAT policy goals of helping achieve them. Next slide, please. So on the land use front, encouraging land use development patterns that support multimodal connectivity. So land use that effectively feeds into an efficient CAT oriented system for mobility, and how those two dovetail together is an important piece of this. Equity, we've spoken on many times. Obviously, we've got a subcommittee oriented towards this now, making sure that underrepresented groups or disadvantaged groups are part of this equation, are fully encompassed in policymaking here, so that they can take advantage of these opportunities. Safety is a huge overarching policy goal as well. Of course, safety of the transportation system, as well as environmental benefits. So reducing local and cumulative environmental benefits for mobility is a big piece of this, the policy goals as well. Next slide, please. So with that, we wanted to talk about, really this proposal, the question that we've put forward to the Executive Committee, and the proposal herein is really to use the adopted CAT policy goals as a framework for action. The policy goals were adopted, obviously, as kind of a broad construct for directing the work group. We want to take a deeper dive into that and look at kind of prioritizing some overarching approaches to work group direction, as well as some specific suggested actions within that as well. And ultimately, the important piece out of this is providing direction to the subcommittees. So there's a lot of ground to cover in this topic area. The subcommittees have done a tremendous amount of effort in moving forward on a number of fronts. Our hope coming out of this discussion is that they come away with a better sense for what are the priorities of the executive committee, how should they be focusing their time. And when we consider factors for establishing these priorities, we want you all to be thinking about from the standpoint, what can realistically be done in the remaining time of the work group? So we know we have 3 years left. 3 years may seem like a long time, but we're already approaching the halfway mark through this work group. So it puts it in perspective about these are big issues that take time to work through. So what do we think can be done in this remaining amount of time? What's most needed to get Washington State out of the starting blocks? So what are some of the things that are most critical at this early juncture in vehicle automation to really be able to move Washington forward in a safe way? We want to ask you, and we're going to ask this kind of specific question here coming up in our polling. What are the minimum objectives you feel the work group must achieve to be successful? We think this is kind of an important question at this juncture to step back and say, at the end of this work group, if we have achieved X, we consider that to be success for what this work group needed to accomplish. And finally, is it too early to attempt to understand regulatory needs for some particular areas? And I think there's potentially a lot of examples of that where there are really big issues that need to be addressed, but do we simply not know enough now, or we're too far away from implementation, if you will, to really be able to make meaningful progress on specific regulatory actions? So I think that's how we wanted to kind of frame up this discussion, if you will, and move forward from that perspective. So with that, next slide, I believe we're now going to transition into our polling question. So I'm going to, if you could, Catherine, again, pass control to me, I will start up our polling exercise here. Okay, so I hope you can all see this. So if you're not familiar with it, we're going to use a live polling software called Mentimeter. And I hope this is fairly easy for you to use. As a reminder, we are asking only the executive committee members to participate in the polling today. The information is at the top of the screen. Where you can see going to menti.com, MENTI.com, and you're going to enter the code 69895. So you can do this in a separate window on your screen if you're following along, or you could do this on your phone, simply through a web browser on your phone. Go to menti.com and enter that code to get started, and you will join the poll. And then you will be able to select your options from there. So we're just going to get started with a fun one just to work out the kinks, get everybody comfortable with the technology, and get on board and joining the poll here. So we'll take a little bit of time to do this. Start with, how anxious are you to get back to the office? So we've got to ask the pandemic related questions here and take a straw poll. It looks like quite a few people are able to join in here. All right, and a good diversity of responses here. Never need to see an office again, running in the lead. Pandemic has changed some minds. All right. Great. So we've got about 21 responses so far. Personally, I'm kind of getting hooked on the sweatpants, but I'll put on grown-up pants and head out one of these days. All right, well, excellent. And it looks like we've got a good group that's joined here and is able to get onto the poll, which is really all we wanted to get out of this. But thank you for sharing. Glad to see a good kind of diversity of thought on this one, and looking forward to seeing responses on kind of our next poll questions here. So we're gonna go down to the next one. So we're going to start with the real questions here, and we want to start with really looking at kind of the broader work group focus areas. So we're asking you to rank these in priority, and we've set out just 3 really broad areas for you to consider here. Just focusing on near-term testing needs. So essentially, what types of changes are needed to advance forward testing of highly automated vehicles in Washington State? The second is focusing on near and long-term deployment needs. So as we look beyond testing, look at commercial deployment or sale of vehicles, what types of changes are needed to support that? And then finally, asking about focusing on achievement of CAT objectives. So we just talked at length about CAT, focusing on that and mitigating potential negative impacts of AV technologies. So those are kind of our 3 broad areas we need to weigh in on, and I see many of you already jumping in on this, which is great. So while you're answering, I just want to share, we're going to go through each of these poll questions just to make sure that we've got time to navigate through this. And then we're going to provide some time for discussion and dialogue towards the end of these poll questions here too. So we will allow some some feedback and dialogue on this as well, but we want to advance through the poll here to get us started. So I see about 21 responses so far, and again, it looks like much like opinions on heading back to the office, we've got a good diversity of opinion on this, with really kind of close alignment between these 3 higher level objectives. And that's really helpful to know, and that certainly validates why we're going to ask you the next set of questions, assuming that there may be some balance across these. So I see 24 responses, which looks like we had previously from the committee. So let's go ahead and advance forward to the next question. So from here, we're going to dive into each of these focus areas. We've kind of outlined some preliminary activity areas that we're asking you to similarly weigh in on. And we're going to start by looking at, okay, the order flipped on the last vote here. Testing came up narrowly on top here. We're going to start with testing and look at activities within this. So 3 activity areas that we're specifically asking you to take a look at here and prioritize. One is implementation and or revisions to House Bill 2676 on autonomous vehicle testing and reporting. The second is furthering discussions with companies that are in the self-certification system through Department of Licensing, really to understand what's motivating their testing decisions, what would drive them to test within Washington State, and understanding that kind of across all of the subcommittees. And then the third is to specifically look at identifying and pursuing funding opportunities to support pilot and testing activities. So what role does this group need to play in helping to identify funding to actually advance forward and possibly encourage some testing from third parties, commercial entities within the state. So we'll just give this a few minutes here. Looks like we've got a good number of responses in so far. So it looks like discussions with companies kind of coming out on top so far. It would be great to follow this up with our industry panel coming up here later in the meeting. Just give another minute here for our final responses before we move on. Okay, very helpful. Appreciate this feedback. It looks like we've hit 25, which I think is our magic number. And it looks like kind of continuing those industry discussions is coming out as a more clear here on top, as well as followed by reviewing the well. So very helpful there with funding priorities kind of in the third spot from a priority standpoint there. So that's excellent. Thank you for that feedback. We're going to go ahead and move on now to the next question and pivot towards deployment related activities. So we've got a few additional options here. So one that there's been quite a bit of discussion about is review of the Uniform Law Commission model bill language piece, which is also related to House Bill 2470. So that's one of our activity areas. Identifying and adopting AV guiding principles, so AV data guiding principles, excuse me. So really getting into to AV data. How does it need to be managed? Who owns it? How does it need to be protected? And really, how does that get applied kind of across all subcommittee areas more broadly as well? There's another area of activity here for you to prioritize. Near-term infrastructure investments. So this could be signing and striping improvements. It could be broadband. It could be encouraging and supporting cellular 5G deployment. Any of those things to help develop out the AV ecosystem. Developing a prioritized list of topics for legislative reform. So there's a lot of areas here related to video screens in vehicles that may need to change, Public Records Act, a number of different areas that AV really changes the game from current definitions and may need to be addressed. Developing an education plan to communicate benefits and limitations of ADAS, so advanced driver assist systems, so essentially lower levels of automation and driver assistance support, as well as AV, so nearer term types of considerations here. So we'll just give this another minute. It looks like infrastructure investments is coming out a little bit more clearly here from a priority standpoint, as well as topics for legislative reform. Okay, well, it looks like we've about hit our number here and have some clear kind of tiers of priority here as we look at this. So this is great information. We are going to go ahead now and move on to our last kind of ranking order poll here. And this one is now getting into to CAT-oriented actions. So our third kind of focus area of more directly relating to CAT policy goals, and a few different action areas that we wanted to evaluate here. One was to conduct some scenario planning exercises to look at alternative futures and understand and get a better sense of potential impacts and policy implications. So examples of this could be looking at a future that is more shared mobility focused versus one that is more centered towards kind of a continued individual auto ownership type of model. How would policies need to change? What are some of the potential negative impacts of those? And what types of policy mitigation measures may want to be in place based on that? So, kind of an overview of the scenario planning discussion. Prioritizing a set of deployment scenarios to enable more focused policy and strategy discussion. So getting into some very specific use cases based on the policy goals so that you can get into some discussion more narrowly about a particular use case rather than more the full ecosystem, if you will. So developing engagement opportunities for disadvantaged communities for work questions. So really focusing on making sure that voices are at the table to ensure equity is central to the discussion here. And then finally, developing equity guiding principles to apply across all of the subcommittees. So, so really understanding kind of what is going to guide this group's work towards health and equity objectives, and looking at how does each subcommittee need to factor that into their choices and their actions, their policy guidance. So we've got most of our input in here. Looks like scenario planning is coming out as a priority with this group thus far. Okay, well, we've hit 26, and it looks like scenario planning has kind of come out as a top priority with some even distribution for our other action areas here, which is great. So let's go ahead and move on from there. So we want to give a chance, particularly in this virtual forum where we know it's hard to engage fully in dialogue across the table. We wanted to give just kind of an open answer format here. And we're going to pause here as well and start to allow in Q&A discussion as well. But you know, what did we miss? Obviously, this is a broad topic area. Certainly the actions that we touched on were not all encompassing. The approaches are not all encompassing. So we would really be interested in your feedback and thoughts. What did you not see that you feel should be prioritized here? Are there other areas that you think that the work group needs to be considering as a high priority as we move forward into the next 3 years? So we'll give you some time to respond on this. And I know obviously long form answers take a little bit longer here. So in parallel to that, we do want to open it up now and provide some opportunity for discussion Q&A. So if you are interested in asking a question, go ahead and type it in to the chat window, and we'll be able to call you out and unmute you and be able to start some dialogue here as well. So just give that a minute, and team, if you can help flag what questions may be out there so far as well. So.
Yes, Scott, this is Rima. I just wanted to make sure everybody knows, because you're on mute, if you can use the chat box to let us know you have a question or a comment, that will help us unmute you so you can talk.
All right, well, it looks like we're getting some great responses in here. Not surprisingly, some questions on COVID and potentially the impact on AV development. And I know that that's something we had already flagged as a topic of conversation for the September meeting as well. So that's a great one.
Scott, I have a question from Sam Zimbabwe from the city of Seattle. Sam, did you want to unmute and ask your question?
Sure. I was actually typing the question in the wrong box, so I put it back in the. I meant to type it in the survey function, but typed it in the chat. So disregard.
Thank you, sir.
Very good. Thank you. Well, great. This is excellent. I'm getting some good feedback in here. Yeah, I encourage anybody, if there's, a particular area that you typed in that you'd like to speak more to with the group, by all means, kind of read and type something into the, we can unmute you and provide an opportunity for a little bit more dialogue around this as well. So I'll just scroll here a little bit and allow folks a chance to read some of these as they're coming in. Okay, some great input here. Just give another minute. Allow anybody else to finish typing here before we move on. All right, last call. Any other final entries into the poll, or anybody want to jump into discussion before we move on? All right. Well, very good. This is great feedback here that we'll capture. Thank you all for taking the time to type in your responses here. We've got one more question for you, and again, we'll kind of provide an opportunity to open it up for discussion as well. And again, another kind of open-ended question here, back to what I alluded to in the startup presentation here. We're really interested in your thoughts. What single outcome do you see as most critical to the success of this work group? So if we get to the end of 2023, what must we have accomplished to really be considered successful? We'd love your input on this one. And again, offer up, if you would like to speak to the group on your thoughts on this, please go ahead and enter into the chat box as well, and we can unmute you. But certainly, everything that you enter in here we'll be capturing as kind of input that we can then take away and kind of help guide direction going forward. Great, getting some input here. Anybody want to jump in on thoughts on this topic? Share your thoughts perhaps on what you're typing into the window. Great, we're getting a lot of responses in here now, which is great. Just give it another couple minutes here to allow people to finish responding. Great, it looks like we're getting thoughts from almost everybody here, which is really helpful. Kind of look to compare these and reconcile them and kind of summarize out themes that we're seeing in all these responses here going forward. Just give another second for any final thoughts. I'll give just one last call as well for any discussion. Anybody that wants to jump in on mic to have some discussion with the group here. Last call. All right, well, it looks like we've got just about everybody, some great diversity of responses on this. I think will be really helpful to just kind of set us in the right mindset going forward. So let's just advance forward here and talk about next steps. So we're going to start by synthesizing the input from this. So everything the poll will be capturing and you know, putting together thoughts on kind of how those priorities fell out, how they applied, how different subcommittees can act upon them, and synthesizing out the discussion topics as well, just so we can get some good feedback and direction out to the subcommittees. We're going to update the roadmap for the remainder of the work group effort to kind of align with these priorities and time sequence the priorities a little bit. And then really factoring these into future meeting topics as well. So a big part of these meetings and what we're trying to do, of course, is to make them very topical for the priorities of this group. So this input is hugely important to get us centered around that and make sure that we've got the right topics, the right presenters, that we're focusing in the right areas. So, so very much thank you again for your input on that. And with that, I think we will transition to the next agenda item. I'm going to go ahead and stop my screen share and kick it back to Catherine so that we can head to our next topic.
Thank you, Scott. This is Jim. I'll go ahead and introduce our next speaker. So next we have Michelle Radovich, partner with Davis, Wright, and Tremaine, to discuss the Uniform Law Commission Model AV bill. Michelle? We can see you, but we can't hear you.
Okay, now can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am, we can. Thank you.
This is, I've been doing a lot of Zoom calls, but I am not as familiar with this particular technology. So thank you for this opportunity to talk with you. Let me just tell you a little bit about myself. I'm a commercial lawyer. I do a lot of state tax work. So I'm not a professional in the automotive field, but I'm a member of Washington's delegation to the Uniform Law Commission, and I served on the drafting committee for the Autonomous Vehicle Uniform Act. And I noted in the last presentation that many of you were interested in multi-state cooperation of some sort, and the uniform law concept gives you kind of the opportunity to do that. I will see if I can go to my slide deck here, or do you? I would be happy enough if because I've given you the presentation, if you wanted to show it, and I will just indicate when to move.
Michelle,
Does that work?
Catherine.
Yes?
Yep, just get that for you.
Okay. That would make it a little easier for me, I think. Perhaps while they're getting the slide up, I could go ahead and talk a little bit about the Uniform Law Commission, which is the first of the slides. The Uniform Law Commission is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that was formed back in the late 1800s and includes members from 50 states, Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, the District of Columbia, and other U.S. territories. The commissioners are all volunteers. Nobody is paid to do this. They include some legislators from almost every state. They also include judges, practicing lawyers, law school professors, all lawyers, but not necessarily all legislative lawyers. It is funded by state appropriations. Every state pays dues to the organization, and Washington is definitely part of that. Can I stop here? Are you having trouble getting the deck up?
Yeah, are you not seeing it?
Michelle, we have the deck displayed. I'm not sure why you're not seeing it, but we're on your.
Okay,
Right
okay,
now.
I've got it. Thank you. So this slide is okay. The slide. Let me see if I can back up here and start again. Sorry to be technologically inept here. So the ULC drafts legislation on topics where uniformity among the states is desirable and practical. So this is what speaks to the comments that were made during the last presentation. Drafting meetings are open to any interested party. In this case, we had a lot of input from consumer groups, trial lawyers, the automobile industry. So there was a pretty there was a pretty wide participation among lots of groups. The process started back in 2014. study committee with a study committee, which is kind of part of the process. We look at whether uniformity would be desirable, whether it's possible to implement these things before we actually start down the road of drafting. Then in 2017, the drafting committee was formed. And at the 2019 summer meeting, the commission formally adopted the draft that you have see today. And that was in cooperation with House drafting committee staff, was turned into what is House Bill 2470. So the uniform law does not cover every single aspect of automated vehicles, kind of, because it would be difficult to do so. So it does not cover testing, because testing was going on out there anyway for research and development purposes, and many states already had statutes that dealt with testing. It doesn't deal with remote driving, which is really a different beast, where there is a human person, they're just not inside the vehicle. And it really did not deal at all with just the assisted driving features. It starts at level 3 and goes through level 5, if you're familiar with the federal safety levels. What it does try to cover is this uniform law really zeroes in on deployment of automated vehicles on public roads. And so traffic laws and enforcement, vehicle registration, driver's licensing, those kinds of things, which are traditionally a state function. So the Uniform Act is a hybrid act. It is not a whole new code for driverless cars. It is a mapped onto existing law and takes existing law and then looks at the areas where it may need to be changed. So the Motor Vehicle Code continues to apply as is, except to the extent that the Act affects a change. And the principal change here, and what we'll talk about more later and hope get some questions on, is an additional registration requirement that there be somebody who comes forward and takes responsibility for the vehicle's ability to comply with the rules of the road in the particular jurisdiction. And so that is the automated driving provider concept, and it's pretty integral to the Act. The Act tries to account for the fact of diversity in terms of the scenarios and models, as you were just discussing. We recognize there's a lot of legal. It also addresses, it also recognizes that federal, state, and local governments have different roles in automotive safety, and we try to respect those roles. So let me actually go.
Michelle, could you please, we're advancing your slides for you on the main screen, so if you could let us know when you need them switched and the page you're on.
Okay. I'm sorry, I was doing it myself too. So 3 key points: automated driving. 1 will be very diverse. Are you there?
Yes, just please indicate what slide you're on so we can track with you.
It is 9.
Thank you.
Are you on 9 now? There we go.
Yep, we're on it.
Okay. So go on to the next slide, please. Don't know quite why that. And one more. Okay, automated driving will likely be very diverse. So, you know, this act tries to recognize that there will be both fleet operations, and those will probably come first, but that in the long run, there will be private individuals owning these cars. Some of them will be manufactured with the automated driving equipment. Some are also likely to be aftermarket additions to a car. There just are a wide kind of variety of possible scenarios out there. And so the thought was to try to be broad enough to contemplate those different scenarios, at least with regard to compliance with the rules of the road and motor vehicle registration. Next slide. So this is, you know, part of the diversity is also in the types of driving. So these are the different vehicles. Some, you know, a level 3 vehicle, you may need to drive if prompted to maintain safety. You may want to drive in a particular situation. It just in order to reach your destination. Maybe the automated function works on the freeway but won't work on city streets. And then there are you know, level 5 vehicles on the drawing board anyway, which you will not need to drive for any reason whatsoever. So again, we tried to contemplate all of these scenarios in drafting the law. Next slide. I don't know, I assume, I guess, that all of you have actually learned about the various SAE levels here. And the important thing to recognize is that we are not dealing with the assist features like cruise control that are level 1 or level 2 features. This act is meant to apply at level 3 and beyond. Next slide. So this goes back to what I was saying about various kinds of features. You could be driving, but you're assisted. Those are the kinds of things that are on the road already. Automated driving is different than that. Automated driving requires that the car really be able to drive itself using software, although it may have a limited area in which it can operate. Next slide. So this goes through the various scenarios. Individuals with subscriptions for features, that may be a common model because the software is going to need to be updated fairly frequently. That's going to be able to comply with the rules of the road as cities and states change traffic patterns. So those are the various models that we were looking at. Next slide. Okay, so this really does narrowly focus on the state's vehicle code. It does not attempt to resolve issues with regard to liability or insurance, which are, you know, two giant topics. I have always said that in adopting this, there will have to also be an insurance piece that could be part of the same bill, could be separate. But the insurance industry wasn't at all ready to offer that piece when we were working on this bill in terms of models. And so it really is something in addition that has to be addressed, but is not addressed in this bill. In terms of liability, why don't you go to the next slide? In terms of liability, I think that there is that it was the consensus that really nothing necessarily needed to be done. That may not be true in every state, but there was a feeling that existing tort law in most cases would cover the operation of automated vehicles in much the same way that it already addresses the operation of vehicles, and that we don't need to go in and change tort law. Then the Uniform Act involves not the federal roles in vehicle safety. We tried to concentrate on the state role. And so, for instance, it addresses equipment safety in the sense of maintenance, but it does not address the safety standards that presumably will be set by the federal government, as all automotive safety standards are currently. Next slide. So in current law, the federal government does the federal motor vehicle safety standards. It investigates for non-compliance and defects, and it issues recall requirements. And state governments deal with products liability, vehicle registration, vehicle inspections, roadworthiness, rules of the road, driver's licensing, and the different colors there relate to whether it's the manufacturer being regulated, the owner being regulated, or the driver being regulated. And the difference between the owner and the driver becomes really even more important, that distinction, when we get to automated vehicles. So next slide. So the under the Model Act, the role of the federal government, of course, remains the same because we're not touching that. And the kinds of requirements at the state level that apply to manufacturers and owners remain the same as well. The big shift here is that the kinds of regulations that apply to the driver of a vehicle under current law are shifted to the ADP. So roadworthiness, compliance with rules of the road, and even driver's licensing, or the analog to driver's licensing, are shifted to the ADP. Next slide. So here is more about the ADP. Who is the driver? Who is the driver of an automated vehicle that's under automated operation? Under the Uniform Act, the Automated Driving Provider, or ADP, is the legal driver of an automated vehicle that's under automated operation. And the ADP declares itself to the state and designates the automated vehicle for which it will act as the legal driver. So the manner in which that is done could vary from state to state. So in an ideal world, the VIN number would tell the state that it was a automated vehicle and which manufacturer was responsible for it. That may not be the case. People may you may get a certificate when you purchase a car that you then take into the Department of Licensing, and when you go to license your car, and that shows that the car is an associated automated vehicle. In order to be able to register, though, the ADP has to make certain representations to the state, and those are representations that then can be used by the state to regulate safety, at least as it applies to safe standards on Washington roads. So the ADP doesn't necessarily have to be the manufacturer, but it certainly could be. It could be a fleet operator. So a fleet operator could, in fact, be responsible and register as an ADP with the state, and then also, register its vehicles as associated automated vehicles. So we tried not to specify who could be an ADP because there are so many models out there that it's hard to know which of them will really stick in the long run. And so as the bill is drafted, any of those kinds of companies could be a ADP, so long as they are basically making representations to the state that the vehicles are safe and can comply with the rules of the road. And if they fail to comply on any kind of regular basis with the rules of the road, then presumably the state has the authority to revoke, and not presumably, the act gives the states the authority to revoke the registration as an automated driving provider, in which case the vehicles would not be allowed to operate on the roads. So there's a really powerful club. The ADP concept gives states a powerful club to try to ensure that the vehicles that the ADP provider puts on the road are capable of complying with our laws. Next slide. So again, only an associated automated vehicle may be registered in an enacting state. Once the vehicle has been associated with an automated driving provider, the rest of the registration process is just as it ordinarily is. So it just uses the act uses the motor vehicle registration framework that already exists out there as it applies to both kinds of vehicles. But it adds on this self-identification by automated driving providers. By using the existing framework, we sought to, I guess, do two things: is recognize the authority that state motor vehicle agencies have, but the other was simply to provide consumers with a relatively easy way to comply with the law in terms of registering their own vehicles, to make it as much like the present process as possible, even though we were adding on certain requirements. Next slide. So again, this goes back to products liability. We had the trial lawyers and the insurance industry at the table, but we opted not to take on tort reform or to change products liability law as it relates to vehicles. What we did recognize, and why the insurance piece is so important, is that under current law, fault is the determinant for tort law. And obviously, if the human being in the car is not responsible for the operation of the car, but the software is responsible for the operation of the car, then somebody standing behind that software ought to be able to be liable. And existing law actually provides for that. We have lots of situations out there where in a traffic accident, there are there is fault of a human driver and fault on the part of the automobile manufacturer. So say there's a actually relatively low impact accident, but the seatbelt fails. The failure of the seatbelt and the injuries that come from the failure of the seatbelt are at the foot of the manufacturer, whereas the initial accident may in fact be the fault of the human driver. And our system allows for both a products liability suit and a regular motor vehicle suit being brought together in the same action, and juries can apportion fault between the various entities. So current law already deals with that. But there's going to be a lot more products liability questions arising in automated driving than ever arise under the current system. And product suits traditionally are very expensive because they require engineering experts and all, a lot of investigation and an expert testimony. And so they're not as so easy to resolve, and they're not necessarily very cheap to resolve. And so low-level accidents that really don't cause that much damage are not good candidates for product suits, because the cost of bringing the suit is more than what you could recover. And so there has to be some insurance mechanism out there that provides for prompt payment of this kind of small, lower level auto accidents, even if they involve an ADP rather than a human driver. And that really does not exist. So next slide. So what we do provide in terms of responsibility or liability in the Act is that violations of the motor vehicle code that are caused by the software are still able to be handled under the citation system, the speeding ticket. So the tickets can go to the automated driving provider, who will be, required to register with the state. And the ticketing system, the citation system, also then allows, as those pass through the Department of Licensing, also allows the department to kind of keep track of defects that might be systematic defects that may be out there, not one-off situations. If an automated vehicle is not under automated operation, the human driver will get the speeding ticket. And yes, the state patrol will have to distinguish, or the city police will have to distinguish between those situations, but they're kind of forced to do that now. It will be more frequent perhaps, but even under current law, somebody can claim that that the reason they went through a red light is that their brakes failed, and that's a fact that is ascertainable. And so these kinds of things we thought could be worked out. And they may be hard at the beginning, but expertise will develop in terms of being able to tell the difference, and sending the ticket to the human driver, who then goes to traffic court and says it was my brakes or whatever, and brings some kind of proof with them, won't get the ticket, so, or won't be charged with a citation. They have the ticket. But next slide. That's it. So I would be happy to take questions, because I've talked fast. And I'm sorry if I garbled up the beginning of the presentation through my technological problem, the one in my head.
No problems, Michelle. I have one question from Representative Phi, Chair of the House Transportation Committee. Why, given the evolving nature of the industry and industry objection to the terms automated driving provider and associated automated vehicles, have they modified their definition or taken industry concerns into account?
The industry was at the table all of the time in numbers, in large numbers. Every single one of the major manufacturers, I think, was at the table, and they always objected to this. But understand that they object. They may pretend it's a technical objection. They object to the idea of being responsible under the law of the state for the operation of the vehicle. I mean, they would have you basically leave it with the owner of the vehicle. And it was the clear view of the committee, which included judges and legislators, that that was a really unacceptable solution from the standpoint of the consumer, that the consumer was entitled to have to be able to look to the manufacturer or some other entity, the fleet operator standing in the shoes of the manufacturer. So it wasn't that it did not come up. We had multiple votes on it because the manufacturers kept bringing it back up and back up and back up. Yes, we knew they don't like it.
Thank you, Michelle. The next question is from Francisca Mailer. It says, the bill assigns legal responsibility to the ADP, but the ADP only has limited control over the software components of the automated driving system. How do you see that work when the functionality of the sensor suite is an integral part of the ADS?
So the ADP is, first of all, the ADP is not necessarily only responsible for the software. I mean, that is certainly the primary thing. In the case of a regular automobile manufacturer, both the sensors and the software are going to come from the same entity. Yes, they may have different, the manufacturer may have purchased these things from sub-suppliers, but again, under current law, they have recourse against those, the people that provided them, because they're their own vendors. So there clearly is a way for the manufacturer to go after others. If it is a problem that the sensors are not working because of improper maintenance, that then becomes a driver, not a driver, an owner question. The owner is under current law responsible for keeping the car in good driving condition. So having bad sensors because of, say, buildup of slush in the wintertime, it is definitely a situation in which a citation could be issued to the owner of the car to fix that situation and hopefully not have it happen again. But that kind of, again, that kind of split between the owner of the vehicle and the manufacturer of the vehicle, it exists in current law as well. And there's definitely accidents caused by poor maintenance out there.
Thank you, Michelle. The next question I have is from Kurt Augustine. He actually wants to be acknowledged. So Kurt, you have the floor.
We need to unmute him.
Yes, hi, my name's Kurt Augustine. I'm with the Alliance for Automotive Innovation, and I feel compelled to respond to some of the comments that you have just made regarding auto manufacturers and their agreement and for responsibility and liability. And I don't think it's far from accurate, and and frankly, pretty borderline dangerous when you're accusing automakers of refusing to take responsibility for the products that they are selling and the liability. Nothing can be further from the truth. And I can't let those statements go by. There's not an and I represent all but one auto manufacturer who sells vehicles in the United States. There's not one of them who does not accept full responsibility for every product that they sell that rolls off their line. And for you to say that they were in negotiations and wanted to completely absolve themselves of any liability regarding autonomous vehicles is not accurate and is far from the truth and that is current situation. I would also say that I'd agree with some of your things regarding no need to touch tort reform laws. However, we completely object to the ADP principle that it in fact does that by creating a new entity and design that's not in any state currently, has not been accepted in it, and does change that. So we do have some very strong objections. And again, I felt very compelled to respond to your accusations and allegations that auto manufacturers do not stand behind their products and are not legally responsible for their liability.
Well, we haven't touched tort law, and I wasn't really talking about tort law with regard to that. Answer me the question, how does a state ensure that a particular type of particular manufacturer's vehicles are complying with the rules of the road in their state? What happens if a particular kind of vehicle from a particular manufacturer consistently, runs through red lights, to take maybe the easiest example? Doesn't the state have to have some mechanism for compelling the manufacturer to fix something?
We believe that both current federal and state laws do that, and that that there is not that those instances can be resolved under current law.
How?
Right now.
How? I mean,
Well,
there's no contractual.
with all product liability law. Excuse me.
No, we're not talking about tort suits here. Tort suits will go on as current law allows you to get at the manufacturer. I'm talking about the right of a state government here to have safe vehicles operating on the roads. Don't state governments deserve the some tool in which to force a particular manufacturer who has a vehicle that is not compliant to fix it?
We believe all states have a law enforcement role in that, and we're not against state by any means having states have the ability to enforce laws, whether it's traffic laws, liability laws, insurance laws, all the things that are currently on the books. There's in our belief that that is their absolute role of the state, and a product. Yes, please go ahead.
But how? I mean, the state has no ability to ticket. Without the ADP, the state has no ability to issue a citation.
Well, there is still a vehicle owner. There is still a vehicle owner and responsibility, and it's no different than current. I mean, if a vehicle has a known problem right now, whether it's non-autonomous or not, there are still abilities to resolve those problems. I mean, my goodness, there are safety recalls regularly that are both initiated by the manufacturer or by the federal government. That's the current system can continue to work with automated vehicles.
That goes back to what I said. The auto manufacturers believe that having the owner continue to be responsible is just fine. And it was consensus.
No, that is not what. No, that
Okay,
is not
folks,
what I just said.
Hold on, folks.
And
Hold on.
let's take another. I don't want to take up too much time. I just want to make it clear that manufacturers accept responsibility for their products and accept all that liability. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Kurt. Appreciate it. Thank you, Michelle. Appreciate the lively debate, folks, but we've got a lot of other questions and we need to move on. So next question is from Francisca Mailer, and it says, initially the hardware and software is under manufacturer's control, but the maintenance of the sensor suite will need maintenance and repair, e.g. if there's a crash. The manufacturer has an unlimited right to terminate the automated driving agreement under the bill. So how is a private owner's right to operate and repair their personally owned automated vehicle protected? Current law recognizes the owner's right to repair.
Well, I think that you've kind of got two different situations there. If there's an accident, I mean, in the one-off situation, there's no revocation or nobody kind of stepping away from the vehicle. And the owner is totally free to repair and put the thing back on the road. Revocations are going to take place, I believe, only when there are systemic problems with a particular vehicle. And I guess I have to believe that the state government is not going to do that high-handedly, that state government is going to give a manufacturer plenty of warning that they're non-compliant, that there's a problem and that they need to get it fixed before they would ever consider revocation. I think the tough problem is aftermarket kinds of things, and I can see where a consumer could get caught with an aftermarket product that can't be used. If there's nothing in the law that would prevent, however, a vehicle from continuing to be used without its automated features. So it isn't as if somebody kind of loses their entire investment, but the aftermarket stuff is somewhat problematic, and I don't think anybody has a good handle on how much aftermarket stuff will be out there and how all that will develop. I certainly think that there could be a need for additional regulation in the future, depending on kind of how this develops.
Thank you, Michelle. I see no other questions at this time. Are there any other questions from exec committee members? Okay, we'll go ahead and move. Oh, actually, I got one more.
Okay.
From George Inovov from the web. It says the ULC bill appears to primarily cover personal car ownership, while the primary commercial use cases in discussion in Washington and other states are on ride hailing, local delivery, and heavy duty trucking. Each of those categories has specific operator criteria in every state. And how do you see the ADP concept aligning with these existing categories?
So I think it's going to be different with different categories, excuse me. So I think that fleet operation is not very difficult to align here, because they still are, private automobiles in a way. It's just that there are a lot of them, and in a way maybe easier because the owner and the ADP are likely to be the same entity. So there isn't some of the problems go away in fleet operation. I don't think this necessarily aligns with big commercial operations. And I don't think that we actually tried to do that. Again, a lot of those may involve one-off situations. I mean, in the sense that just the use in a particular use may not be widespread. It may be one entity doing that, although there are multiple vehicles involved. So it's easier to kind of go in and deal with the situation as it exists. The bill is designed for fleet operations or for privately owned automobiles. It is the kind of the vast majority of the vehicle registrations out there.
Thank you, Michelle. I appreciate your presentation today. I don't see any other questions, so we're going to go ahead and move on. Are you going to stay with us until the end?
I'm sorry that I can't do that, but I will stay with you for the next about 25 minutes, but I have a hard stop at 11 o'clock.
Understand, no problem. Thank you so much, ma'am. We appreciate it. Okay, folks, we're going to go ahead and move on. The next presenter is Rochelle, I'm going to say Calabrese.
Very close, Calabrese. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Senior Manager, Government Affairs, Cruise LLC. So you have the floor, Rochelle.
Great. Well, thank you so much for having us. And I think that today really set us up for a great discussion. I think everything that went before is a really good introduction to who and what we are. So like I said, I'm very excited to be here today alongside my fellow panelists. My name is Rochelle Calabrese, and I am Senior Manager of Government Affairs at Cruise. I do have responsibility for the Washington market, and if I can share a point of personal privilege, I'm really excited to be here talking to you all today, if only virtually, as a University of Washington School of Law alum and also former King County Council staffer. So I'm sure you're having better weather than I am. As you may know, Cruise is an all-electric autonomous vehicle company with a vision of providing shared transportation services to passengers and goods. And so we will be contemplating that fleet model that we were all just talking about. Although we're headquartered in San Francisco, we do have offices in Phoenix, Arizona, and as of last summer in Bellevue, Washington. If we could advance to the next slide. So I always like to start with our mission because I think that it helps to ground who we are as a company, but also talk about where we are going as an industry and what we care about and where we're trying to go. So our mission is to build the world's most advanced autonomous vehicles to safely connect people to the places, things, and experiences they care about. And I like to start here because of that emphasis on safety. So we have baked safety in not only from the get-go of everything that we're doing, how we're building our vehicles, how we're testing, how we intend to deploy, but we want to make sure that it is so centered in everything that we're doing that we've put it into our mission statement. Next, I'd like to talk to you a little bit in the next slide about where we've been and bring you up to today. So like many other companies, we are a true Silicon Valley startup. The company was founded in 2013 with 35 employees and one office here in San Francisco. Things really started to change in 2016 when we started our partnership with General Motors, and that only increased with our partnership with Honda, T. Rowe Price, and SoftBank, who came in and not only partnered with us and invested, but in the case of Honda, has also been a great partner in terms of developing our vehicles and developing our AV technology. We are testing in San Francisco. Prior to COVID-19 pandemic, we were testing 24/7 in the full, what we call 7x7 of San Francisco. Obviously, with the shelter-in-place orders and with just being responsive to the pandemic, we did fully ground our fleet for some time. And if we have time, I can talk to you about how we have worked to partner with our community to meet a need. And so we have, for the last about 8 weeks, been partnering with the San Francisco Marin Food Bank as well as SF New Deal to provide meal delivery through our autonomous vehicles to our most vulnerable residents. So that's something that if we have time, I'd love to talk to you about where we think that AVs can go and how they can be part of the community. And really, I think, again, that goes back to showing our commitment not only to safety, but where we think this can go and into the future. As I mentioned, we are also testing in Phoenix some pilot programs, and we have a closed course track that we use outside of Detroit, which I'll talk about in a little bit. The other thing that I wanted to talk about on this slide before I advance, I think you'll note that very early on, Cruise was one of the first participants to submit the voluntary safety self-assessment to NHTSA. And in fact, we submitted a rather robust appendix to it shortly thereafter. So for those of you who are familiar, it's pretty hefty, but I think that it just, again, shows how committed we are to safety and where we see our communications going with regulators and governments. Next slide, please. So I've talked a little bit about where we've been. Before I dive into what we're doing today, I want to talk a little bit about where we anticipate going. And so this photo here on the screen for you all is the Cruise Origin. And this is the vehicle that we debuted at the end of January, which I'm sure you can all attest, even though it's only been 6 months, it feels like a long time ago. The Cruise Origin is also an all-electric vehicle. Again, our commitment to not only creating a shared autonomous future, but a shared electric autonomous future. And this is a production-ready vehicle that we created with Cruise in partnership with GM and Honda. And our goal was to say to ourselves, what would we create if we didn't have to build a vehicle for a human driver? We took out everything that was in a current vehicle that is aimed at the human driver, the steering wheel, the rear view mirror, the side mirrors, the brake pedals. And what we were left with was pretty much the wheels. And that allowed us to really design our next autonomous vehicle, the Origin, for people, for cities, for this shared electric autonomous future. And so if you see in the photo, the doors are designed to slide outwards and very close to the walls. And that's to create not only additional space for ingress and egress, but also to ensure safety of passengers, pedestrians, bicyclists who might be walking by. It's also multimodal, so we can use it for both the transportation of passengers and goods. So we're very excited about the Origin. Like I said, it's production ready, and it's something that, because obviously it is a completely redesigned vehicle, we're going to be working very closely with our federal regulators and the U.S. Department of Transportation on moving that through. But we have announced that it will be built in production at the Hamtramck plant in Michigan. So that's a little bit of a preview of what's to come. Next slide, please. So I showed you how we started and where we're going, and I want to dive in a little bit more about where we are today and the product that we have on the road that we're testing in San Francisco. And then I'll move into a discussion about some of the regulatory frameworks that we are operating under and some considerations for Washington. So in this slide, what you have is, and I hope your eyesight's good, but what we have is an illustration of our vehicle. This is the Cruise AV, which is built on a Chevrolet Bolt platform, so it's all electric. But what we've done, as you can see in the lower slide, is we have built our sensor suite, our autonomous vehicle sensor suite, into the frame of the vehicle, so that when it comes off of the plant in Lake Orion, Michigan, it is a fully functioning autonomous vehicle that is also electric. So we have built the computer, the LiDAR, the cameras, the radar into the vehicle itself. And these are the vehicles, our third generation vehicle that we are testing in San Francisco today and throughout the United States. I want to talk a little bit about that testing. I know that's not something that we've talked a lot about, but we have multiple levels of testing. And because we have a fleet model and we are intending to deploy a fleet model, what that means is that through all of the testing, the real world on-road testing with the simulations, with the closed course testing, all of those combine to mean that what one vehicle learns, the rest of the fleet will learn. And so it's through that iterative process that we're able to move quickly and also to really gain learnings very quickly throughout the whole fleet. And this is, I just want to pause and think about what this means for driving and for improving driving behavior, because for you and I, if I were to, drive my vehicle and get a speeding ticket, let's say, the only person to have learned anything from that experience is me. Through our vehicles, if there is an obstructed stop sign, or if there is, something that isn't quite working with the code, if one vehicle learns it, the rest of the fleet will learn it, and that will dramatically improve safety over time. So that's just one of the benefits that we see to not only autonomous driving, but to fleet autonomous driving. Next slide, please. So the other thing that I touched on, and this goes back to our response here in San Francisco to the COVID-19 pandemic, we believe that it's important not only to win the technology race to make sure that our all electric autonomous vehicles are performing in the way that they should and are driving better than a human driver, and reducing or eliminating those deaths annually that occur because of crashes. But we also have to win the trust race. And what we mean by that when we talk about it is the trust of our community. And so this goes back to the education piece that I think we talked about a little bit earlier, but also working with the community to make sure that the community understands and knows not only what the benefits of the autonomous vehicles would be to the community, but really wants to be a part of it and understands that we're part of the fabric of the community. So in this slide, I have a few different photos of ways that at Cruise we've been working with the community. So we have the Pride Parade here in San Francisco, obviously from a year or so ago, our work with Human Made, which is a local nonprofit, and the Cal Academy of Sciences, where we had our vehicles out and we were able to sponsor nightlife. Last slide. So I see my fellow panelists coming up, so I'm not sure how much more time I have, but I did want to briefly run through some of the Cruise guiding AV regulatory framework principles to talk to you a little bit about our experience in California and Arizona, as well as considerations for Washington going forward. So the first most important thing for a company like ours is a clear path to deployment. So the laws and the regulations should explicitly authorize deployment of fully self-driving vehicles and remove existing roadblocks that assume that there's a human driver behind the wheel. And so what do we mean by that? So California has done a very good job of this, as has Arizona through its executive order. And what this means is that it's not only a testing regime, but also a deployment regime. I think we talked a little bit about it here earlier on the call. Washington has a very good pilot program or a testing program regime, but there isn't a clear path to deployment. And so that's one of the things that, as industry, before investing, the significant amount of people and time and effort into a state, that's really what we're looking to see. Testing in a real world environment. And so that means that ensuring that all domains are available and it's not just limited to a certain particular test track or one small area of a highway. In order for our vehicles to really understand and get those learnings, they have to be able to be exposed to the things that they're exposed to here in San Francisco every day, and that's the double parked cars, jaywalkers, people wearing hats that have flamingos on their heads. All of those things our vehicles need to understand and learn, and that's how they're going to develop. So that's something that Washington has so far been really great at, and we would love to see that continued onto a deployment path, and as well in California and Arizona. The next point is about statewide applicability. So one unified statewide framework to avoid a patchwork of regulations is key. You can't have a different set of regulations in Bellingham, from Tacoma, from Spokane, and expect for these vehicles to be able to not only test but deploy. And this carries over to regulators and to how we're communicating and who we're communicating with. So in California, I think that when Dr. Soriano spoke last meeting in May, I think that even he mentioned that in California, we have two regulators. We have the Department of Motor Vehicles and we have the California Public Utilities Commission. So having even two regulators at the state level is something that is, I think, challenging. And I think that if you ask them, they would say that, you know, coordinating is something that is challenging. So having one central repository in Washington State, that seems that it's going to be the Department of Licensing, which is fantastic. And so providing that notification to the Department of Licensing that we're going to be testing, here's our ODD, here's where we're going to be testing, and having DOL work with, in the case of HB 2676, work with the local jurisdictions, the local law enforcement to notify them. I think that's going to be something that would be hugely helpful to industry because quite honestly, having lived in King County and worked in King County, we wouldn't want to miss a local law enforcement office or, you know, some unincorporated part of King County through oversight and not because, you know, not for lack of having information and wanting to be transparent. The last two I'll touch on pretty quickly. So a service neutral approach. And so what that means is a framework that allows for both the transportation of goods and persons. Again, Washington is very clear on that, so that's great. I think the only other thing that we would say here is that the ability to actually deploy commercially, so to charge fares. I think Dr. Soriano touched on it last month, that is one issue in California that we're all still continuing to work on and discuss under the testing framework. And then finally, a technology neutral approach. And I think that this touches on a lot of the discussion that went on earlier today in this meeting, which is that, you know, governments are encouraged to allow this new technology to mature and really to avoid overly prescriptive approaches that could inadvertently constrain progress. And so I'll talk a little bit about us. We are what's known in the industry as a full stack. So you saw we create a cruise AV that comes off of the line and it is ready to go. But there are a number of other members of the industry who are only building and focusing on one part of that AV stack. Maybe they're only working on the LiDAR. Maybe they're only working on, you know, some of the radar, some other aspect of the computing system. And we want to make sure that they are able to be part of that ecosystem and that they're able to make those strides and those innovations. The other thing is that, you know, just because we are taking this approach, even our competitors who are, you know, also making full stack vehicles, they may have a different view of how to get this technology to move forward. And so we want to avoid basically laying the framework that we have for how a human-driven vehicle works and what we've been doing now on top of this new technology as we're iterating and trying to optimize. So I know I've gone a little bit over time, and I want to make sure that there's time for questions or that my other panelists can speak. But that's a brief introduction to Cruise and also to our regulatory framework. My email is on this slide, so please reach out to me if you have any follow-up questions that we don't get to today.
Thank you, Rochelle. Appreciate that. We have one question from Representative Shelley Kloba, and it was in regards to the Cruise origin. How does this vehicle accommodate people with disabilities?
So that's great. That's a great question. And one of the reasons that we designed it the way that we did, I talked about the sliding doors. It's also built lower to the ground. So while the prototype, the production ready vehicle does not have the ramp, it does have additional space so that there's the ability for two people to go in and out at the same time, or for someone who is in a walker or a foldable wheelchair, that step is very low. And again, as we've talked about the iterative process, that's something that we are committed to working through on that end. The other thing that I'll say, and there's a lot that can be said about individuals with disabilities, not all disabilities are about wheelchair access. So we have done a lot of work with the National Federation of the Blind and other members of the blind and low vision community to ensure that our current vehicles, as well as the origin, will be responsive to their needs. So we had a number of focus groups, for example, where we had members of the blind and low vision community come out to Cruise and take rides with human rideshare drivers and narrate those rides and those experiences so that we could get those learnings about what's important for them. And we have incorporated those learnings not only into our current Cruise AV, but also into the Origin. So I don't want to take up too much time, but the bottom line there is that one of the really impactful learnings that we found from those focus groups is that, you know, for you and I, if a rideshare driver parks across a crowded street and we have to cross the street in order to access that rideshare, we can get that. We can do that because we are sighted, and this isn't an issue for us. It's an inconvenience, but it's not something that's going to potentially make or break our ability to get that ride. For the low vision and blind participants in our focus groups, that was something that was hugely impactful for them. That the ability to have the ride appear exactly where you have put that pin and where you expect it to be is the difference between getting a ride or not. So again, we are working with various members of the disability community, not only for our current Cruise AVs, but for the future. And it's one of those things that we're not going to be able to get it all the first time around, but we are committed to getting there.
Okay, thank you. On the same vein, we have another question from committee member Anna Zavarts, who's the Disability Rights Washington representative, and she asks, are Cruise vehicles wheelchair accessible?
The current Cruise AV is not, because it's a Chevy Bolt platform, and again, that is the vehicle that we're testing right now, and we're not providing rides to the public. The Origin is designed to be used by the low and in certain individuals, so the low vision and blind community, as well as the hard of hearing and deaf community, and as I said, for foldable wheelchairs and for folks with walkers. Yes, again, we have some leadway time to continue to work on the other parts.
Thank you. And a follow-up question, have you released a list of best practices, accessibility features Cruise is incorporating into your vehicles and services?
We have not. You know, obviously, we are talking a lot about the things that we're doing, but we are pre-commercial. We're still in testing mode, so we don't have a list of things that we are incorporating into our service because we don't have a service right now. But I think it's one of those things where, you know, obviously this is something that we're very passionate about, and we would love to hear from you and continue to work with you and additional members of the community how we can going forward.
Thank you. And just a quick response from our member, blind and deaf use wheelchairs as well, so you should be mindful of that.
Yes.
Okay, and then I have a question. Are there laws, regulations, or policies in place in Washington that would prevent you from testing, deploying in Washington right now?
So I think that it's not that there's something in place that prevents us, but that there's not the guarantee or I should say the certainty on the path forward to deployment. So obviously there's a testing system in place, but not understanding how that can go from testing to deployment, I think is one of the things that would cause a company like Cruise to hesitate to invest in the testing without the clear path to deployment. I think, again, you know, kind of touching on that single uniform set of framework and also one regulator that we're working with to provide the information, and then, you know, working with that regulator to get that information out to local law enforcement and others. So I think that it's not that there's something that prevents right now, but I think that we can improve on what's there for testing and also continue to work toward a framework that allows for full deployment.
Thank you. Other questions or comments for this member? For this panel, excuse me. So I have one more question. What are your thoughts on the question of how safe is safe enough? How much testing needs to be done, and how should safety be regulated? This is from your point of view.
From my point of view, or well, from Cruise's point of view. So I think that we are working very hard on safety, and I started the conversation talking about Cruise's commitment to safety, how it's in our mission, and what we've done. We are members of the Autonomous Vehicle Safety Consortium, so we are one of the founding members, and we work to put out best practices. I did not touch on our safety drivers, our autonomous vehicle training operators, but we have a very rigorous program where we have 2 AVTOs in the vehicle at all times, ready to take over and at any time and to really move forward. We have committed publicly, and we say this every meeting that we have that's in all hands, that we are not going to deploy until we believe that the vehicle is safer than a human driver. I don't have any dates for you. I don't have any specific timelines, but working with the current framework and working with other industry members who are also extremely motivated and committed to safety, we believe that the current framework is incentivizing the industry for where we're at now, which is the testing period for level 4 and level 5. And we are moving toward best practices as an industry. Like I said, we are members of AVSC. Cruise is also, I believe with my other panelists, a member of the recently announced US Department of Transportation AV Test Initiative. We are also members of numerous other organizations, including PAVE, which is focused on education and outreach to the public, and that's a partnership, a nonprofit that's a partnership of industry, academia, and other nonprofits. And so we are working in a lot of different ways to ensure that safety is ensured, but also that we can continue to test and continue to learn in order to get this life-saving technology to market and to our communities and become part of those communities.
Thank you, Rochelle. Appreciate that. I don't see any more questions. I want to thank you for your presentation today, and we're going to move on to the next item on the agenda. Our next presenter is David Wosner, Executive Vice President, LM Industries Group, Incorporated. Welcome, David. You have the floor. Need you to unmute yourself, sir.
Thought I had done that. My apologies. Thanks, Jim, and good morning, good afternoon to everybody. Thank you for having me. Unfortunately for everybody, it says David, but it's actually pronounced David. So I'm glad to be here and to talk to you about LM Industries and what Local Motors has done around testing our low-speed electric autonomous shuttle named Ollie across the country and the world. So if we can go on to the next slide, please. So a little bit of an overview. LM Industries has been around for about 13 years now, and over the last 5, since we've developed and prototyped Ollie, we've been 3D printing self-driving electric autonomous shuttles. And specifically, we do that in a concept called a microfactory in Knoxville, Tennessee, that gives you a lot of flexibility in being able to build and develop purpose-built, low-volume niche vehicles. Ollie, as you can see here, is a level 4 autonomous shuttle, battery electric operated, and currently limited to a max speed of 25 miles an hour. And we've done extensive testing and validation on both public roads, limited ODDs, as well as obviously on private courses and various simulation models that have been followed over the last 5 years as we've developed this vehicle and this technology. We're actually on the 2nd generation of the vehicle, which is now called Ollie 2.0, and it's currently in production in Knoxville, Tennessee. And as soon as we're allowed to safely deploy our vehicles in the various markets that we're in, we will continue to do so. Next slide, please. So these are some of the deployments. Again, they're dated January of 2020. We haven't, due to the COVID crisis, we haven't deployed new pilots or testing efforts around the world. but you can see the orange dots are ones where we've currently had deployments or testing, and in the black dots are where we're planning to have deployments and testing. Most of the next 10 minutes I will spend talking about where we are deploying and testing our vehicles and in what kind of environments. And certainly we've been engaged with a number of stakeholders in Washington State via our OLLI Fleet Location Challenge last year to discuss how to test and deploy OLLI in the Washington region. Next slide, please. So a couple of deployments and environments that I'm going to talk about. So one of the earlier OLLI 1.0 deployments was at the University at Buffalo, where we started in 2018. It was a research grant supported effort sponsored by the governor and the state of New York. And we have been deploying there for the last 2 years on a private campus to really understand the impacts from both a sustainable clean energy perspective, but also from a use case perspective of how autonomous vehicles can be used on a closed campus like at the University at Buffalo. Next slide. So then, speaking of kind of some completely opposite operating environments, in late 18, we deployed into the winter of Buffalo, which obviously also allowed us to do some cold weather testing. And then in early 2019, we launched a pilot on the south coast of Australia in Holdfast Bay, which is part of Adelaide, and where we were looking at operating OLLI in a very low speed environment that was originally designed for pedestrian and bike traffic solely along a about 1.2 kilometer route on the a very touristic area of Holdfast Bay, right along the beach. And the measure was primarily to enable certain parts of visitors within that environment to traverse along the beach where they may have in the past not been able to enjoy the beach or go from one end to the beach without some sort of challenge. So that was a 6-month pilot supported by the South Australian government's Future Mobility Lab. And we also obviously worked very closely with both the Australian federal government and the South Australian state government on the appropriate regulatory requirements to enable a driverless shuttle to operate in Holdfast Bay. Next slide, please. The other thing is we've continued to look at OLLI as a open platform for vehicle and technology development. And so we've partnered over a number of years with organizations, both large and small. For example, in 2017, 2018, we launched the Accessible OLLI project with IBM Research and the CTA Foundation, and deployed a accessibly focused OLLI vehicle based on the latest technologies that can serve people with various disabilities. And we've continued that process with, for example, Goodyear, which is starting to test non-pneumatic tires on the OLLI. And we're actually deploying and testing that vehicle at private sites in Michigan and Ohio, at the University of Michigan and at the Goodyear headquarters in Akron. So we're really using the vehicle to not just, test consumer preferences and customer preferences from an operating perspective, but also understanding the latest in technology and how a technology has to adapt for autonomous vehicle use cases. One very specific point is is generally when, you know, a human operator goes around a course, there's a varying degree of accuracy. When an autonomous vehicle goes around a closed fixed route, it generally hits the same point at a specific turn within an inch every time, which obviously gives you a much different wear pattern, for example, on tires. So some of those things are what we're studying and the impacts of autonomous vehicles on tire wear. Next slide, please. So as part of our, I mentioned the Ali Fleet Location Challenge. We actually launched that in September of 2018. And the first deployment was with Sacramento State in Sacramento, California in February of 2019. And we actually deployed two Ali vehicles for a 3-month period on a closed campus in collaboration with, you know, the Sacramento Area Council of Governments, their ATOS group, which is their autonomous testing and operating special interest group, as well as working with Californian Congresswoman Mitsui, the mayor of Sacramento, the president of Sacramento State, for this 3-month pilot where we actually transported students and faculty around a closed loop and fixed route stop on the Sacramento State campus. Next. We then expanded that challenge to actually have a second 3-month deployment with 2 Ali at the Cal Expo and the California State Fair, which was supported by the Sacramento Municipal Utility District. And that continued throughout the spring and early summer up in California and Sacramento. And again, it was open to the public, but primarily a closed course transporting guests from the parking lot to the multiple expo entrances to the state fairground. Next slide. Our co-founder and CEO, Jay Rogers, is a Marine, and we've had a long-standing ongoing collaboration with various parts of the U.S. Department of Defense. It started with DARPA, it went to Army Rev, and is extended with our work with the U.S. Marine Corps over the last several years. And in summer of 2019 at Joint Base Meyer Henderson Hall, just outside of Washington, D.C., it's adjacent to Arlington National Cemetery, we started deploying 2 Ali vehicles for a 3-month trial on a military base, which you know, is essentially a closed campus, but it is very much a mixed use traffic environment with pedestrians, bicyclists, other traffic, both you know, regular passenger vehicles as well as bus vehicles, public safety vehicles, and so on and so forth. And we did that for a 3-month pilot, and we've continued to expand and are planning to actually, we were supposed to launch a pilot in Miramar at another U.S. Marine Corps installation in February, but that got delayed due to COVID. So we're continuing to look at the use cases of using a level 4 autonomous technology to connect military bases and improve military access to mobility for visitors to the bases, access to the base, and obviously for the members of the military and their families to use on the base. Next slide. One of the final pieces of the expanded Sacramento Fleet Challenge, we then launched in Rancho Cordova, California in Q3 of 2019, where we were working again with the Sacramento Area Council of Governments to really connect a corporate campus that had about 1,600 employees, and we were able to provide, you know, transportation to various businesses within this business park and corporate park. So starting to really engage the public in California, not just the private users at, for example, Sacramento State, as well as also going to kind of a a corporate campus rather than a closed college campus, for example. Next slide. I went to Georgia Tech down in Atlanta, Georgia. Peachtree Corners is one of the many things named Peachtree in the Atlanta area. And we worked with the Curiosity Lab, which is a consortium consisting of Georgia Power, Sprint, Delta, the city of Peachtree Corners, obviously, Local Motors, as well as Georgia Tech, to investigate a living lab of next gen technology, which included 5G enabled connectivity, fast charging station powered by Georgia Power, as well as various research being done on next generation mobility, including the deployment of OLI. And we did this on public roads over a relatively large campus on a 1.5 mile test track, but that was on a public road. And so we're starting to really engage not just on private campuses, but starting to make the transition to public roads and interacting with mixed use traffic. Next slide. Partnering with AAA, Gomentum, and Contra Costa, we are looking at truly scaling this technology for future large-scale transit deployments and connectivity from a first and last mile perspective. The testing is being done on a private site, but the goal is to start deploying OLI in the near future on public roads to connect the public transit network within Contra Costa County. So again, starting research basis, controlled environments, closed campuses, and continuing to move to ever increasing use cases and complexity in environments and less defined environments, less controlled domains, but still operating at low speed and doing that testing and increasing the capability of the technology. Next slide. And so this is what you can see where we're fully operational on public roads as part of a phase 3 that has been in close collaboration with the Maryland Department of Transportation, the Maryland Motor Vehicle Administration, the governor of Maryland in National Harbor, just outside of Washington, D.C., where we're now providing daily operations to the general public to use OLI within what I would call a urban mixed-use environment, primarily roads less than 20 miles an hour of speed limit, but full mixed-use pedestrians, bicyclists, vehicles, transit vehicles, large conference center of 2,000 rooms. Largest, actually, the Gaylord National Conference Center is the largest conference center on the East Coast of the United States, working towards connecting that to the MGM National Harbor, which is one of the largest casinos and entertainment complexes on the East Coast. And so really working towards mixed use deployments. Next slide. We're also not just doing this in the US, but we have done it in Australia, where we launched late last year a living lab on a very large campus in Saudi Arabia. While it's on a closed campus, it is mixed use environment. And so we're continuing to obviously continue to expand the use cases and the environments. Tuwal, Saudi Arabia is on the Red Sea. So average temperatures are in excess of 90 degrees for most of the year and very high humidity. So obviously this impacts vehicle performance, both from a battery perspective and from a sensor perspective. So these are all the things we're trying to test from a use case environment for the validation of the technology. Next slide, please. And we're moving into Europe, where we're preparing for public road homologation, which is obviously critically important to continue to expand the service. we're working in Italy, Germany, and the Netherlands on doing that. Have been slowed a little bit due to COVID, but that's what we're working on. Next slide. I think this is the last slide. So testing and deployment, I think to echo the comments from Rochelle earlier from Cruz, you know, we have closed course and simulation, but the point of testing and deployment is to really do it in various environments, various use cases that lead to improvement of the technology, which have found themselves into our Ollie 2.0 vehicles from our Ollie 1.0. We've also obviously have a better understanding of customer and consumer preferences and requirements. We understand what consumers and riders deem safe and how they feel about the technology and where they have concerns, both quantitatively and qualitatively. And then we've just recently been named to the NHTSA AV Test Initiative, which 8 states are a part of and 9 organizations. I think GM Cruise is also one of those organizations, as is BEEP, to collect and share data with various state and federal agencies to continue to build awareness, but also to show and validate that this technology is safe to deploy within our cities and our regions. A couple of considerations for the AV working group from a regulatory and legislative perspective. We continue to work with federal and state regulators to remove unnecessary barriers. A couple of examples, for example, in Maryland, I've been on their AV working group since 2015 when it was founded by Chrissy Nizer, the motor vehicle administrator. And, you know, we worked with them very closely. And at one point they thought about introducing legislation through the state legislature. But then it was determined that within their current motor vehicle code, we could actually test and deploy autonomous vehicles without needing to introduce new legislation. And so if you don't need to introduce new legislation to deploy and test vehicles, we have found that it's advantageous to not do it, because obviously legislation is always a challenging process normally. We do encourage, though, the removing of unnecessary barriers to make sure we have a clear path, and so adjusting current rules where appropriate. We've been working very hard with NHTSA to level the playing field in a number of instances around FMVSS. And then where there are new rules required, we want to, work with federal and state legislators to develop or change the relevant laws without introducing new or other barriers that could prevent the adaptation or deployment of this technology. And then we're always open to collaborate with many stakeholders to collect and share relevant data at the appropriate level to educate regulators and legislatures, but also the general public. The one thing I would note there, again, from our experience in Maryland, when we were about to deploy our vehicle in Prince George's County, right outside of Washington, D.C., the county was getting caught up in some of the micro mobility rule writing around scooters, and they wanted to subject autonomous vehicles to some of those same requirements. And we went back to the state and said, guys, let's work at a state level, because I don't want to work with 52 different counties to develop 52 different permits for us to deploy vehicles. So we worked and the state enforced. There's one AV permit process, and then the state collects the information that they want to collect and disseminates it to the appropriate local authorities that want to partake and be made aware of what testing is happening where. And currently we're doing that with the state of Maryland, and then they disseminate it through their AV working group to the relevant local authorities that want access to that data. So those are some of the outcomes and considerations of over 2 years of testing, deployment, and development. And glad to answer any questions. Thanks again for having me.
Thank you, David. Appreciate your presentation. I have a question from committee member Representative Mary Dye. It says, what are some of your findings when you deployed the vehicle on the bike walking path in Australia?
Actually, you know, again, one of the things that we found is that there's a lot of acceptance on both the pedestrian side and on the rider side. For various reasons. One, because of, you know, how low our vehicle is and how open and visible it is. We did, you know, pre and post rider surveys, and a lot of fears were alleviated with once people took a ride on the vehicle from both a safety and an interaction and a perspective and a you know, challenges perspective. The one thing that we didn't quite or haven't done is necessarily take some of the pedestrian data of how did they feel about interacting with an AV. But for example, one of the findings was it was a very wide range of views on, is the vehicle too aggressive with getting, you know, too close to pedestrians, or is it not aggressive enough? And I think some of the, you know, some people felt that the vehicle ceded too much power to the pedestrians, and in other cases, people felt that, oh, maybe 2 feet of the vehicle passing a bicycle is too close. And so those were some of the things that we learned, but overall, people felt very comfortable riding in a closed corridor, interacting with pedestrian and bicyclists, and overall felt very safe, i.e., you know, a net promoter score above 85 in terms of riding an ollie.
Thank you, David. I'm not seeing any other questions, so I'm going to ask you the same questions I asked Cruz. Are there laws, regulations, or policies in place in Washington that would prevent you from testing, deploying in Washington? I noticed that on your map earlier, you showed that you have upcoming testing here. So,
yeah, we're working with a number of stakeholders and collaborators, both private and public partnerships, to find the ideal locations to deploy our shuttles in Washington. And what we've continued to find is that, you know, your self-certification process that we've worked through in 2019 is going to enable us to do that. And we want to have that in place and continue to have that in place so that we have a clear path to testing and hopefully ultimately to full commercial deployment. And our perspective is that as long as those things are in place, we don't see any hurdles at the moment to doing testing and piloting in Washington State.
thank you, David. The last question I also asked Cruz as well. What are your thoughts on the question of how safe is safe enough? How much testing needs to be done? And how should safety be regulated?
Yeah, you know, I think that there's a lot of facets from my perspective to that. And I think there's certainly, you know, the vehicle safety versus the operational safety. And I know that gets dicey between, you know, where does NHTSA's view of safety end and where does, you know, the state's view of safety start, you know, from an operational, you know, licensing, permitting perspective versus the vehicle safety. And if the autonomous system really is the driver or the operator, then is that a state matter, or is that a federal matter, or is it both now? So I think those are certainly things that it's a little bit above my pay grade on how to regulate safety. I think our view is that long term there should be one overall national framework, and in the short term we should be as flexible as we can be while assuring public safety to go and put this technology on the road in its intended environments. Certainly our stated objective is, you know, 0 accidents and 0 fatalities, and knock on wood, we have not had any accidents with our Ollie vehicles in autonomous mode to date. And so that's our view on how safe is safe. Safe is no accident.
David, are you there?
Finished.
Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you for the presentation. I see no other questions, so we're going to go ahead and move on. Thank you again for your presentation today, David.
Thanks, Jim.
Next, we have Joe Moy, from CEO of Beep. Joe, you have the floor. Need you to unmute, sir. There we go. We can hear you.
Yeah, okay. Sorry about that. I was just saying that I sent out a warning sign. I'm sitting in the middle of a thunderstorm, so if I disappear, you'll know I lost my internet, and it wasn't a lack of interest in this event here, but appreciate the opportunity to be with you here. I was asked to, one, provide a brief introduction to our business and some of the work we're doing in the deployment of autonomous shuttles, primarily in the state of Florida, although we're expanding into other states as we speak, and also share some lessons learned around those specific deployments and kind of what we've been able to take from those and how we've been able to advance the safe deployment of these vehicles and more complex use cases. So let's go to the first slide. Just by way of a brief introduction, and you know, I would submit to you that I think it's important as we look at the autonomous arena. You know, I segmented into the fixed route, geo-fenced, controlled speed operating domains versus the anywhere, anytime, any speed, you know, type deployments that, you know, both are very important as we see it, and the learnings that we've got to gain on how we ultimately can deploy these vehicles in any and all use cases. But I think you're, you know, seeing them develop at a different pace. And I'll give you some examples of that as it relates to the work we're doing. But we are focused squarely on delivering these first mile, last mile type use cases in private and public communities with electric multi-passenger 8 to 10 seated passenger configurations. Again, in these geo-fenced fixed route environments, and I'll share with you in a minute how we're evolving those to provide a much more extensive, even on-demand capability for these mobility services. Let's go to the next slide. And again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the drivers behind this. I'm sure everybody on this call is well aware of it. I tell you, there's a couple of things that stand out to us as really, really important. It's not only, you know, the issue of safety as it relates to how these vehicles operate in their given domain. In our case, it's also, since our objective is to provide an alternative to personal transportation, is how do we remove cars from the roadway and address some of the congestion issues in city centers and other communities, address some of the parking issues that exist out there, but also impact safety by, you know, categorically removing vehicles from the roadways. You're gonna, you know, just by simple math, be able to improve safety of the mobility areas that we service. Let's go to the next slide. I'd mentioned, you know, just in our brief introduction there, mobility as a service to us is providing kind of a turnkey end-to-end set of skills and resources to take these vehicles from the, as my colleagues have hit on, some of the regulatory approvals that need to be in place to ultimately have routes approved, all the way through to the operations and maintenance of these. Today, we operate these vehicles with safety attendants on board. Although they're operating on average at about 93 to 95% autonomy, we have safety attendants on board as part of our approvals with NHTSA and the use cases that we're deploying these in. But you know, that end-to-end service and then delivered with ultimately the ability to provide remote oversight, monitoring, and management of these vehicles. Although we have attendants on board today, we're building out a command center where later this year, it'll be done this fall, we'll be able to start providing a monitoring services, monitoring both video, monitoring the telemetry data to ensure the health of the vehicle itself, and then ultimately being able to take over some remote command and control functions, be that start, stop, be that the ability to maneuver around an obstacle. The thing I tell you that's different about how we operate, when I say 95% autonomy, I would tell you that the only times that we haven't operated in autonomous mode are when a vehicle comes across, let's just say there's a flag person there because there's road construction going on. These vehicles are designed to stay on their route. So although they can stop, start, react to what's on their route, today they're not capable of necessarily maneuvering around a situation that a human would ultimately be able to perceive and respond to. And that's a real important piece of the maturation that we have to go through with these technologies. And a piece of that's going to be in the business and the market that we serve, the ability to take on remote control of certain functions in the support of these services. Next slide, please. And I hit on these, and I would tell you, we're as a founding leadership team and investment group, we're technology entrepreneurs that have partnered up with some fleet management and transportation specialists. But I say that because the one big observation that we have as it relates to the deployment of these vehicles is it's one thing to focus on the vehicle itself and what needs to happen to ensure the physical environment, the safety standards we've talked about, the maintenance and management of a vehicle. Well, the software platform is even more critical to how the vehicle will operate and address some of these safety issues that we've discussed here today. And as we attack these programs, it's not about turning vehicles onto a route and letting them go. It's about everything that has to be done to continue to advance and upgrade those software systems and sensor stacks and other things. So it's a continual process and a fast-moving process. And so we're real proud of what we've been able to do in a lot of the data sharing that we've done with NHTSA, in our case with the Florida Department of Transportation, and some academic groups that we've partnered with in the state to show the log data that comes out of every scenario that we operate in and how we're taking that information and feeding it into the suppliers of these shuttles, much like my colleague David just described with what Local Motors does, to help improve the performance of their vehicles and ultimately continually upgrade that software stack. Next slide, please. Go ahead and build this out for me. I think it's going to be 4 clicks. One more click. There you go. Thank you. I wanted to kind of share with this group here a little bit about how we view the growth of these fixed route deployments that we're partnering with several transit organizations, several cities, several private developers, where we're deploying these vehicles in kind of this evolutionary fashion. If you look at where we are today, we're deploying these autonomous vehicles in these fixed route, point-to-point type deployments. Now, we are on mixed traffic roadways under 25 miles an hour. The speed limit has to be 25 miles an hour or less. We are operating with pedestrian crossings. We're operating with intersections. We're operating with bicycle paths, parallel parking. These are not test track scenarios. They're real live environments, but obviously at a much slower speed configuration. We operate at between 12 and 13 miles an hour today. That adds just by default a layer of safety into how these are able to react to any situations that we come upon. But picture, if you will, starting with a fixed route deployment, and then ultimately our goal is to connect enough areas of a community to be able to provide expanded networks of mobility services. We'll be launching a rider app this summer, actually next month in July, where we'll be able to provide to the users in these communities the ability to actually schedule a trip or even hail a trip, depending on the number of shuttles that are there. We can launch them based on the actual demand and not just a rotational kind of bus schedule like scenario, if you would. The next phase of this, as we see it moving across the continuum, is how do we then create multiple maps within these areas that ultimately have a common destination point, which would enable us to shift shuttles from route to route. As you can see in scenario 4, that gives you the ability to then do route orchestration to where certain demand profiles may require more shuttles in the morning on a particular route or in the afternoon on a different route. Getting that idea of asset optimization to where, we're able to not only start to deliver some real on-demand services, but also really provide a network that enables us to optimize those assets and give these communities a real choice of transportation services, not just from one point to another. And then ultimately, I think, as we see our market, right now we're operating in roads of 25 miles an hour or less. It's not our goal to ever be on highways. We're providing a particular service in this segment of the market, this micro transit arena, that we see taking these vehicles up to roadways of 35 miles an hour, and ultimately, an operating environment for these shuttles of between 20 and 25 miles an hour. Let's go to the next slide. I mentioned the command center. This is a really important piece that we need to think about in the growth of these platforms. Before we can remove an attendant from these vehicles, we're going to need to have the ability to do all the things that would be necessary to ensure the safety of the passengers, be that the vehicle performance itself, be that any situation that might arise, maybe somebody has a health issue on the vehicle, anything and everything that needs to be done to provide the level of oversight and monitoring, and ultimately, as I mentioned before, kind of that remote command and control to keep these fleets operational and provide a high quality rider experience. Let's go to the next slide. Let me share with you one of these communities that I referenced, and really one of our anchor clients in Orlando, Florida, area called Lake Nona. If you ever have the occasion to head to Orlando, let us know. We'd love to have you by and be happy to host you on kind of what we're doing there. We started off with an initial route, a 1-mile route in Lake Nona last September. We have several other routes that we have launched and are launching to kind of create that expanded mobility service that I described before. Last year, we were awarded the build grant by the U.S. Department of Transportation to start creating some multimodal dedicated infrastructure. But that will be a limited number of miles. Most of these deployments are going to continue to operate, in mixed traffic scenarios. But in the first 5 months of deployment on a single 1-mile route within an 18 square mile facility, we moved over 15,000 passengers. The level of adoption was fantastic. The community was an important part of that. What we did to involve them in everything that we were embarking on here. It's a community known for its love of innovation and technology, and so making that community an important piece of how we were deploying these and the decisions we were making on routes, and even the engagement of our first responders. One of the things we launched was a training program for police, fire, and rescue. As we put these vehicles on the road, we need to make sure the community the whole ecosystem of the community is prepared for these. So we did extensive training in both Orlando and Jacksonville around, ensuring that if there were an incident and somebody had to enter the vehicle or operate the vehicle even manually, that they knew the basics of how to approach those vehicles. Fortunately, we haven't had any incidents we've had to worry about, but again, I'd share with you, I think that's one of the most important lessons learned. So we'll be deploying probably upwards of 30 vehicles ultimately across this network. It's the nirvana of use cases in our world. You've got major medical centers there, you got major sporting activities, events. The USTA headquarters is there now. You've got training facilities, you have retail, and then ultimately the residential, everything from a studio apartment to a multi-million-dollar home. So again, just a perfect perfect case for proving these vehicles out, and something we're really proud that'll frankly represent the largest deployment of these vehicles in a concentrated community in the world pretty soon. Let's go to the next slide. I thought it would be helpful, if you haven't seen anything on this this particular success story. It really was a great opportunity presented to us, and a great opportunity for us to advance the platform. You know, there's a lot of obviously regulation and testing restrictions passed down by NHTSA. We've got a great working relationship with them. As I said, we're doing a lot already to share data and insight from everything that we're doing, and we also, as my colleagues mentioned, are part of the AV test program, which is going to open that up much more broadly for all of us to learn from our respective tests and deployments. But in the case of Mayo Clinic, the Jacksonville Transportation Authority and BEEP were partnering with them at looking at some use cases to move hospital employees from remote parking into the hospital, and they approached us with the need to move these COVID samples from a remote collection area to the clinic that was processing them. And so we took on the challenge of repurposing these passenger vehicles to provide a fully autonomous deployment, much like we would be moving passengers, but obviously we're moving, in this case, these COVID samples on the Mayo campus. It happens to be private roads, but even in private road scenarios, NHTSA, defines those as if they interface with the public and public gets on them, it's a public road, regardless of who owns the roadway. So I share that with you just to say it was our opportunity to go from level 3 deployments to a level 4 deployment in a real live scenario, and that's only going to help us kind of advance the readiness when we get to level 4 deployments here next year. Next slide, please. I know we're coming up on time, so I'm going to go through these. I talked about community awareness. I would tell you a critical success factor for us and the use cases we serve, educating people on these platforms. Some are going to be reluctant to get on this type of technology, so it's a real education process. We need to have people on the shuttles that are knowledgeable to be able to explain everything that happens on these routes. And then ultimately, much like the elevator example, we used to have elevator operators, and then everybody got comfortable operating themselves. It's a similar parallel to what we're seeing here with AVs. Ultimately, when we remove those, those operators or attendants. I mentioned this before, I just reinforce it. This is, in our case, in providing this service, it's not just about having people that can manage the fleets. It's also about having the technologists that can advance the platforms and do the things we need to do from a systems integration perspective to deal with the V2X needs and other types of technologies, edge technologies that we want to use to improve safety and advance the use cases of these vehicles. Let's go to the next slide. I think this will be my last slide. I've got an eye on the clock here. Everybody has said this, and I would just reinforce it from a commercial business perspective. Engaging with our state, local, and federal partners is absolutely critical. We've not had any issues. I know the question is going to come up about Washington law. I'm not as familiar with your regulations in Washington. I can tell you, having deployed in Arizona and in Georgia and in Florida, in several transit groups in our work with NHTSA, we've not had any issues with being able to get these operating domains approved and supported by everybody at the state and local levels. Understanding how we can get funding behind some of these is critical as well. I mentioned the build grant. There's a lot of federal money and state money that can be used to advance these programs, and that's a big piece of kind of what we've brought to the table in the partnerships that we've been able to establish. And I use the example of Orange County and the build grant. We're doing a similar grant for a group down in South Florida. And in the case of Florida, the Florida Department of Transportation has dedicated millions of dollars to test programs across a lot of the transit groups and municipalities. So that's a really important piece of how we advance these platforms. Skilled attendants, we want them to be ambassadors and and educate people and get them comfortable with these solutions. And they have to have, you know, some technology acumen. So it's important to kind of, you know, find the right skilled people and also provide the right type of training. And then last but not least, I just say that, you know, there's a lot of testing going on in the autonomous sector. You know, the thought I would leave you with is, you know, we're focused on delivering a service that is a great rider experience. It's not just about technology and proving out certain use cases. It's also about having a great customer experience. And that means you need to operate these with service level agreements that, you know, clearly state what, you know, head times are going to be and how, you know, these vehicles are going to operate in these given environments. So covered a lot, but I will stop there and throw it back to you, Jim.
Thank you so much, Joe. Appreciate that. We have a question from committee member Anna Zavarts regarding your COVID test transport. Was it followed by human drivers?
We did initially have a human driven car that followed the vehicle, and that was part of the NHTSA requirement for us to segment the vehicle from traffic to be able to get the approval to deploy this. We've since removed that vehicle. We do have a command and control center there on the campus that's doing all the monitoring of these vehicles and operating. But even with the vehicle following it, and that was really a safety measure, we've proven out, you know, the ability to interact, you know, perfectly and incident free over the last 3 months now.
I don't see any other questions right now, so I'll ask you the questions that I asked the other presenters. Are there laws, regulations, or policies in place in Washington that would prevent you from testing, deploying in Washington?
Yeah, and again, I'm not as familiar with the Washington law. I just, you know, reinforced what I said a moment ago is the 3 states we have deployed in, we have not run into any issues relative to local regulation or legislation that impacted, you know, the approvals that we get from NHTSA to deploy these vehicles.
And lastly, what are your thoughts on the question of how safe is safe enough, how much testing needs to be done, and how should safety be regulated?
Yeah, so I'd address it this way. I think one, there's still a long way to go in the maturation of these platforms. Although we've operated in some pretty complex environments very safely, I think we need more and more data to prove out the reality that these vehicles can operate, you know, at a level of safety that is good enough, that is, you know, the equivalent level of safety as they state in NHTSA for the FMVSS requirements. The physical vehicles that we're deploying today are not, you know, crash worthy, which is why we operate them at the very low speeds that we do. That's something that has to be addressed. But I would tell you, I think the learnings that we have in this AV test program is providing a significant amount of information on how we need to calibrate LiDAR in certain configurations and operating domains, as an example, to ensure that it's got enough visibility and a crosswalk to take the appropriate steps. We would tell you that, you know, having operated in a public environment now for, I guess, the better part of coming up on a year without any incidents, it's, you know, the data is going to prove this out. And I think we'll see, you know, in the next year, the ability to start to take these to more, you know, IL4 type deployments. But data is the key to me, and I don't think we're there yet.
Thank you so much, sir. Seeing no other questions, I appreciate your presentation today, and we're going to go ahead and move on with our agenda. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, executive committee members, this is our opportunity to speak. This is an open forum for the next 10 minutes or so. So if you have questions, please add them to the questions box or the chat so that we can answer them. Thank you. I see no questions. Any discussion from the committee? Okay, I see no questions. I guess we can move on to closing remarks. Oh, hold on, we do have a question. Pam asks, what are our next steps? So I guess I'll ask Scott to weigh in on that, or Rima.
Hi, Jim. I guess, take a stab at that. I'm, not sure broadly on next steps, but I think as I mentioned kind of at the end of my discussion, well, certainly one of the takeaways that we wanted to come away with today was about direction to the subcommittees and the polling results. We will be summarizing and synthesizing that and reflecting that in notes coming out of the meeting and updated roadmap for our next 3 years. So those are really kind of the critical next steps from in terms of that aspect of the meeting. I don't know if there's any more clarification if that was referring to something specific or not, but
No, that was all I had. Any other questions from committee members? Going once? Going twice? Okay, we're moving on. We'll go ahead and finish the closing remarks. I want to thank our presenters today. Second here. Michelle Radovich from Uniform Law Commission, Rochelle Celebres from Cruise LLC, David Wozner, LM Industries Group, and Joe Moy from BEEP. On behalf of the Exec Committee, I want to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to present to our committee today. I would also like to thank my fellow committee members. We appreciate your understanding as we navigate through these post-COVID-19 worlds. And lastly, I want to thank the organizers and WSTC staff for their hard work in putting together this meeting. I know of no other business to come before the committee and will adjourn the meeting without objection. Seeing no objection, we are adjourned. Thank you, everyone.